September 1955, New Orleans. A studio called J&M, wedged between a tailor shop and a liquor store on Rampart Street. Richard Penniman stood at the piano, 22 years old, sweating through a session that was going nowhere. He'd been recording for Specialty Records for hours. Slow blues, standards, safe material. Everything sounded polished, professional, forgettable. His producer Bumps Blackwell checked his watch. Studio time was running out. During the break, Richard sat at the piano in a nearby club and started pounding out something he'd been performing for years at late-night shows. A raunchy little number about a woman named Tutti Frutti. The lyrics were so explicit they couldn't be played on any radio station in America. Blackwell heard it from across the room. He rushed over. "That," he said. "That's what we need to record." There was one problem. The song, as written, would get them all arrested. By 1955, American popular music was trapped in a strange paralysis. White teenagers were buying rhythm and blues records in secret. Black artists were creating the most exciting music in the country but couldn't get played on mainstream radio. The industry had a term for it: race music. A polite way of saying this music wasn't for white audiences. But the dam was cracking. Elvis Presley had just signed with RCA. Chuck Berry was writing songs that made white kids move in ways their parents didn't recognize. The market was there. The audience was hungry. Someone just needed to break through with enough force that the old rules couldn't hold. Richard Penniman had been preparing for this moment his entire life, though he didn't know it yet. He grew up in Macon, Georgia, the third of 12 children. His father sold bootleg whiskey. His mother took the family to church every Sunday. Richard lived between these two worlds, the Saturday night juke joints and the Sunday morning sanctified services. He learned piano in Pentecostal churches where the Holy Spirit moved through music, where restraint was a sin, where the point wasn't to perform correctly but to let something larger take over your body. By 15, he was performing in traveling medicine shows. By 20, he was washing dishes at a Greyhound bus station. His music career stalled, wondering if he'd ever get another chance. Specialty Records heard something in his voice, raw, urgent, uncontrolled, but they didn't know what to do with it. Until that day in New Orleans when Richard played Tutti Frutti and everything changed. The song was perfect and completely unusable. Blackwell knew immediately they had something explosive. But the lyrics were graphic, sexual, the kind of material that would get the record pulled from stores before it even arrived. He called in Dorothy Labostri, a local songwriter, gave her 15 minutes to rewrite the words into something radio could play. She kept the title, kept the melody, stripped out everything explicit and replaced it with nonsense syllables and food metaphors. Tutti Frutti all Rudy. No one knew what it meant. That was the point. But here's what they couldn't sanitize. Richard's voice. The way he attacked the piano. The scream that opened the track. Ah wop boppa loo boppa lop bam boom. A sound that came from gospel shouting, from Little Richard channeling the ecstatic energy of sanctified church services into 3 minutes of controlled chaos. They recorded it in 3 takes. When the session ended, everyone in the room knew something had happened. They just didn't know if America was ready for it. The early signs suggested it wasn't. Specialty Records faced an immediate problem. They had a hit. They also had an artist who terrified them. Little Richard didn't just perform songs, he inhabited them. His stage presence was pure confrontation. Pompadour piled 6 inches high, makeup, jewelry, clothes that blurred every line the 1950s had carefully drawn. He moved like no one else. Played piano standing up, kicking the bench away. Screamed lyrics in a voice that sounded like it might shatter glass. This wasn't just rhythm and blues. This was something new, something dangerous. The label needed more material. Fast. They brought Richard back into the studio over the next several months to record what would become Here's Little Richard. The songs came quick. Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, She's Got It. Each one built on the same formula: pounding piano, screaming vocals, lyrics that sounded innocent but felt transgressive. Every track was a collision between the sacred music of his childhood and the profane energy of Saturday night. But there was tension beneath the surface. Richard's family didn't approve. His father had kicked him out years earlier for being different. His mother prayed for his soul. The church community that raised him saw what he was doing as a betrayal, taking the music of worship and using it to make teenage girls scream. Richard felt it too. Even as he recorded these songs, he was conflicted. The music came from something holy, but what he was doing with it felt like sin. The engineer later recalled Richard would sometimes stop mid-session and pray. Ask God for forgiveness. Then count off the next take. Tutti Frutti was released in November 1955. Within weeks, it was clear something unprecedented was happening. The record sold 500,000 copies in its first month. It cracked the pop charts, a black artist with an uncompromising sound breaking into territory that had been nearly impossible to access. But the response was divided. White teenagers bought the record in massive numbers. Radio stations in the South banned it. Parents heard something in Richard's voice that frightened them. Not the lyrics, which were harmless, but the raw sexuality, the uncontrolled energy, the way their children moved when they heard it. Pat Boone, a clean-cut white singer, immediately recorded a sanitized cover version. His version was safe, palatable. It climbed higher on the pop charts than Richard's original. This was the moment Richard had to make a choice. He could smooth out the edges, make himself more acceptable, play the game the way the industry wanted. Instead, he doubled down. Long Tall Sally came next. Richard sang it so fast with such unhinged energy that it was considered uncoverable. Boone tried anyway. His version flopped. You couldn't domesticate this music. It lived or died on Richard's performance. By the time Here's Little Richard was released in March 1957, Richard was the most dangerous figure in American popular music, not because of what he said, but because of what he represented, and he was about to walk away from all of it. The album hit stores while Richard was at the height of his fame. Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, and Ready Teddy were already massive hits. The album collected these alongside newer tracks like She's Got It and Jenny Jenny. Critics didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't blues, it wasn't gospel, it wasn't jazz. It was something the existing vocabulary couldn't quite capture. Some reviewers praised the energy. Others called it primitive, dangerous. A few used coded language about jungle rhythms, racist terminology barely disguised as music criticism. But teenagers didn't care about critics. The album sold. Richard's live shows became cultural flashpoints. Audiences were integrated in ways that violated local segregation laws. Police showed up to monitor his performances. Parents formed groups to protest his influence. Richard played through it all. Every show was a riot. Not metaphorically, actual riots. Fans rushing the stage, venues getting damaged, cities banning him from returning. And then, in October 1957, at the absolute peak of his success, Richard announced he was quitting music. He'd been on a tour of Australia. The plane he was traveling on had engine trouble. He looked out the window and saw flames shooting from the wing. He prayed, promised God that if he survived, he would give up rock and roll and return to the church. The plane landed safely. Richard kept his promise. He enrolled in Bible college, threw his jewelry into a river in Australia, walked away from the music that had made him famous. He was 24 years old. The immediate impact was chaos. Richard's label still had unreleased material. They kept putting out singles. The public didn't know he'd quit. For months, Little Richard was simultaneously the biggest star in rock and roll and a Bible college student trying to become a preacher. Other artists rushed to fill the void. Elvis was already massive. Chuck Berry was writing smarter songs. Jerry Lee Lewis brought similar manic energy. But something was missing. No one else had Richard's combination of raw power and complete abandon. The music got popular, it got successful, but it got safer. The thing Richard had introduced, that sanctified, uncontrolled energy, started getting smoothed out, whitewashed, turned into something the mainstream could swallow. For Richard personally, the consequences were internal. He tried to reconcile the two halves of his life, the holy and the profane, the preacher and the performer. But everywhere he went, people wanted Little Richard, the screaming, wild figure from the album covers, not the quiet minister he was trying to become. His family welcomed him back into the church, but the guilt remained. Had he betrayed God by making that music? Or betrayed his gift by walking away? The music industry moved on, but the album stayed in circulation, kept selling, kept influencing every artist who came after. By the early 1960s, something had shifted. The British invasion brought rock and roll back to its raw roots. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, The Who, all of them cited Little Richard as a primary influence. Paul McCartney studied Richard's vocal style note for note. Mick Jagger borrowed his stage moves. These artists made it clear. The album that seemed wild and primitive in 1957 was actually the blueprint, the foundation everything else was built on. Bob Dylan later described hearing Tutti Frutti for the first time as the moment I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Jimi Hendrix said Little Richard showed him, you could be free. Critics began reassessing what they'd initially dismissed. Rolling Stone, in a retrospective, called Here's Little Richard one of the most important albums in rock history, not just for its commercial success, but for what it proved was possible. Richard himself returned to performing in 1962. He'd tried staying away. It didn't work. The music was too deeply embedded in who he was. But he spent the rest of his career torn between two identities. He'd record rock and roll, then feel guilty and return to gospel. He'd perform wild shows, then give interviews condemning his own music as sinful. He never fully resolved it. The conflict that created Here's Little Richard, between the church and the stage, between sanctification and sin, remained the central tension of his entire life. The influence of Here's Little Richard extends far beyond rock and roll. Prince studied Richard's ability to blur gender lines and make it magnetic. Michael Jackson borrowed his energy and vocal punctuation. Every artist who ever screamed into a microphone, who treated a performance as possession rather than presentation, was following the path Richard cut. But the album's impact goes deeper than technique. It proved that black artists didn't have to soften their sound to reach white audiences. That raw, unfiltered expression could be commercially viable. That the music of the sanctified church could transform popular culture without losing its power. The album was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry. But these institutional honors missed the point. Here's Little Richard matters because it captured something impossible to recapture. The moment when one man's inability to be anything other than fully himself broke open the entire culture. Every integrated concert, every artist who refused to be categorized, every performer who brought spiritual intensity to secular music, they're all standing on ground Little Richard cleared. Here's what Here's Little Richard actually is. 12 tracks recorded by someone who couldn't reconcile the contradiction at the heart of his life. The church taught him music was a pathway to the divine. The world taught him that expressing himself fully meant being cast out. The album is what happened when he chose the music over the acceptance. Richard spent decades trying to explain it, justify it, take it back. But the work speaks for itself. It teaches that the most powerful art comes from unresolved tension. That authenticity doesn't mean being comfortable with who you are. It means being unable to be anything else. The album succeeded not despite Richard's conflict, but because of it. You can hear the struggle in every track. The way gospel fervor and sexual energy refuse to stay separated. The way the sacred and profane collapse into the same scream. Little Richard never found peace with what he created. But what he created gave freedom to everyone who came after. The album still sounds dangerous, still sounds like something that could get banned, still sounds like the moment American popular music realized it could never go back to being polite. That's not because of what Little Richard intended, it's because of what he couldn't help but be. And that contradiction between who he was told to be and who he was is the sound that changed everything.